Dames en heren, goedemiddag.
Hoi hoi, hello and welcome to the Meet Maastricht podcast. I'm Katrina and together with our resident local Lucy, we will be exploring some of the amazing stories that make Maastricht so special. So sit back, relax and join us as we learn about our favourite Dutch city. Welcome everyone to episode 6 of the podcast. This is our Ask a Local segment of our podcasting. Last week we answered a question from Flora's parents about why there are so many churches in Maastricht, and we got a comment saying that someone wanted a little bit more information, and she asked on Facebook why a lot of the churches look so expensive and why religious groups and parishes in Maastricht used money to build a lot of very pretty temples and made them quite aesthetic, I assume, rather than just focusing on the charity and the help for people. So I think we're going to go on a bit of a journey about the churches. So starting from a couple of thousand years ago, I think Lucy's going to take us through the ages of why there are so many churches in Maastricht.
Okay, and I promise I will be as brief as I can. But yes, it is almost 2,000 years to cover here. To be more precise, starting in the 4th century, so the 300 somethings, that's the 4th century after Christ, when Saint Servaas can be considered to be the missionary in these parts who brought the inhabitants to the Christian faith. This is also the time the Roman Empire is slowly, over decades disintegrating. Maastricht was a Roman military settlement, and it did have civic buildings within the military camp, and it did have religious buildings within the military camp. And it is assumed that when Servaas moved from the large administrative center and cultured environment of Tongeren, which was not walled, not protected, to the garrison, the military camp of Maastricht, he did so because it was fortified. There were walls around it. It could be defended because it needed to defend the bridge. So he was the missionary in these parts, and he was the first bishop of Maastricht. That means that if there was a church, a bishop's church at the time, it must have been located within the Roman military camp. We know more or less, well, we're pretty sure where that was. The outlines of it, we have had excavations on several of the remains that are still there. So there is archaeological evidence for a bathhouse and for a temple. What we do not know is where this first Christian church might have been. We suspect under Our Sweet Lady's Church, which of course is still a Christian church, but we've never been digging there. This is one of the reasons why we do not know the exact amount of churches Maastricht has or ever had. It is impossible to compile that list because new evidence is always coming to light, and because conclusions drawn from earlier excavations are from time to time revised.
Yeah.
It must be many hundreds, but we don't know.
Yeah. So what before the Christian churches, what just as a little sidetrack, what was spiritual life like before so what we recognize now as a lot of the churches in Maastricht? Was it a pagan society, or did they have another specific denomination?
Oh gosh, this is really a sidetrack, Katrina. We could do a whole segment on this. I think, for brevity's sake, in these parts, talking about Maastricht around the time of the beginning of our era and the first centuries until Christianity took hold, there would have been a double layered spirituality, so to speak. That would have been, on the one hand, all the gods that the Roman culture brought with it.
Okay.
So Jupiter and Minerva and Hera, and that entire pantheon of the many gods that the Romans revered. And of course the Romans, as in the inhabitants of Rome, also had developed their spirituality in the course of the centuries when their empire expanded. So lots of gods from the east and the south were incorporated as well. So bits and pieces of the Egyptian pantheon and the Middle Eastern pantheon and the Persian gods were incorporated in the Roman as well, and bits of that of course landed here too. So where do you begin and where do you end?
Yeah, definitely sounds like a topic for another episode. I'm sure I would be really interested to hear about that.
No, another series altogether, Katrina. That'll be for the next pandemic, I promise.
Okay.
Anyway, the second layer would have been that of the indigenous population of these parts, which to an extent would have been shifting as well during these centuries. But that also was a pantheon, the Germanic one. And then with gods like, people know them from the Marvel series now, I guess, types like Thor and Wodan and, people like that.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that would have been the pre-Christian religions, and of course they looked a bit askance at this new creed of the one Savior God, who demanded the sacrifice of his only son in order to save us, which makes it very like many of the mystery religions from the East. But that also is an entirely different topic. Talking about the churches,
yes,
what is also important to realize is that because Christian culture was so prevalent, so omnipresent for centuries upon centuries upon centuries, it is very, very important to note this longevity to begin with. And also, which makes this longevity means, it implies there have been many changes over all these many years.
Yeah.
There has been wave after wave of reform within this faith and within all its expressions. So time and again there would be segments of Christian society and culture who would object to the accumulation of wealth within the church, who would protest, who would try to break off, who would try to return to simplicity and poverty and being in service to others. And this was very obvious in the 12th, 13th century, when new monastic orders were started in the cities, because by this time there were lots of cities again. And these new monastic orders, like the Franciscans, for instance, Saint Francis insisted on everybody having, his brothers and his sisters, the Clarissen, founded by his friend Clara. He insisted on them having nothing. These were supposed to be, I don't know the word for this in English again, monks who would go, and sisters who would go out begging, like the Buddhist monks still do.
Yeah.
And it was only in later years that they would build convents and churches belonging to the convents. But the lesser friars, the Minderbroeders, for a long time would walk the city streets and beg for food, and would be kept alive by the populace like that. Because, of course, this is also an aspect, the longevity, the repeated efforts at reform, and one aspect of this prevalence is also that the vast majority of people supported this institution. They did not feel it as something outside of themselves. They felt connected to it in all sorts of ways. They were quite willing. We might say indoctrinated, but that's a very historical way of phrasing it. It was just, how does a fish recognize the ocean it is swimming in? That sort of thing. So, for instance, the the wonderful Church of St. Matthew's on the Maastricht was founded by the nickels and dimes donated by the weavers who occupied most of that area in the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
So poor people would also feel it as an obligation, but also as an honor to contribute to the church in all sorts of ways. And since the church encompassed all of society, it of course also reflected all of society. From the very, very poor, there would be hermits living in a tree. There would be, and living from what the passers-by would give them.
Yeah.
And there would be penitents of all kinds. We might call them masochists because they would consistently hurt themselves.
Yeah.
Laying prostrate on the ground, praying all night, by fasting, by whipping themselves, by wearing hairy underclothing, as the white ladies did of the convent on the Vrijthof, which is the site where later the Generaalshuis, now the theatre at the Vrijthof, stands. So there was all sorts of self-deprivation going on as well, and those people might live in convents with churches. Chapels adjoining them, but it would be very sparse. It would be very, very bare bones. It would be, in many instances also very, very poor. For instance, orders like the Cell Brothers, which we discussed in the first episode.
Yeah.
They were very poor. They were a very poor community, and it always was tiny. And they provided for their upkeep by working for the city and getting fed that way.
Yeah.
So so these are the bottom rungs. But of course, going up, there are the more educated, and there are the more well-to-do, and there are the filthy rich. And of course, they also, there is, of course, everybody being human, there is always this element of one-upmanship. If you are going to build a vast cathedral in city X, then I am going to outdo you by building an even more cathedral in city Y. And all of this was going on, of course. And the same with the big convents and monasteries. There would be donations from the founders. There would be contributions by the rich people saying, "Look how pious I am," and in some cases they probably were. This is not all being vulgar and being materialistic. A lot of this was also absolutely sincere. People worried about their afterlife.
Yeah.
Or people sincerely wanting to do good in the world.
So it wasn't necessarily whatever the religious order or the church, I guess, administrators spending all their money on building a fancy church and decorating something beautiful, which I'm sure would be very much appreciated by people as a celebration of a god. It was more that it was often gifted by, and the money was given to build something magnificent.
Yeah, and like I said, there was of course also always, human nature being what it is, again, silly competition. I mean, for instance, the canons of Our Sweet Lady and the canons of Saint Servaas, they would, for centuries, they have been in this competition of trying to outdo each other.
Yeah.
You are building a new Gothic ceiling in your basilica. Yeah, okay. They only later became basilicas. Sorry, in your church. Okay, then I will build an even more magnificent Gothic ceiling in my church. There, this sort of thing going on. But what you do have to realize, though, is that you should not look at Servaas and churches like it as just a church in just a pretty small town. You have to look at Servaas as something approaching what we would consider a country these days. They would have vast estates spread out over large areas. These would be functioning economic and political entities. And they were keeping loads of people alive as well. Working these estates, producing the flour and the wine and the wood and whatever.
Yeah.
And then administering all of that, and then of course on top of that, in the case of Servaas, that was a pilgrims' church, and not some obscure out of the way pilgrims church either. You know, there would be thousands and thousands of pilgrims coming here.
Yeah.
So, you know, these are big, powerful entities. And yeah, if you go and make your church a pretty welcoming space for all these thousands upon thousands of visitors, you know, I can't really blame them. But yeah, of course, you know, it's like I said before, it is hard to not look at all these things with contemporary eyes. But you know, with contemporary eyes, you can also look at the contemporary conditions. Anyway, so yes, Maastricht has lots and lots of churches because of this you know, stacking up of historical periods with all their peculiarities. The Bishop's Church, the Pilgrim's Church, the Parish Church, the Convent Church, the Monastery Church, the Guild, you know, as in the weavers or the millers or the brewers church. And then in the 20th century, after the Second World War, this slew of parish churches. Yeah, Maastricht has a whole series of generally quite lovely parish churches in the neighborhoods outside the fortifications.
Yeah, I think something that I've been thinking about is sort of inherent in the original question is why there are so many churches is, I guess, a more. So why are there so many more churches in Maastricht? Because there's sort of a inherent feeling that question brings with it is that it's more noticeable here. So do you, from your perspective, do you think there are more churches in Maastricht than, I don't know if there are comparable cities that you could say this is a place that might be similar in it, the way that history has passed through it, that there are less churches than Maastricht?
Well, just let's look at the neighbors. Liège, Luik to the south.
Mm-hmm.
Aachen, Aix-la-Chapelle, I think, to the east.
Mm-hmm.
Of comparable age, much bigger than Maastricht.
Yeah.
And with histories that are to some extent parallel, or also to some extent very closely connected to Maastricht. I mean, the histories of Maastricht and Luik are absolutely intertwined, and that is felt more strongly in Maastricht than in Luik, because the Prince Bishop of Luik for 500 years or so was one of the two overlords, one of the two rulers of Maastricht, the Dutch Republic being the other one. But my sense of both cities is that the situation must have been very similar, and there are all sorts of reasons for why that would not be immediately apparent. Well, of course, Aachen, because of the Second World War. The city, the city was just bombed out by the Allied forces, so a lot was lost then. But Charlemagne's church still stands, and that dates back to the 8th century.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was an imperial church, and there are many, many more, or there used to be many, many more.
Yeah.
And the great cathedral in Luik was destroyed by the people of Luik.
Oh wow!
Yeah. I don't know the details of this story. I'm sure one of our listeners might. Anyway, we're not going to do Luik in this series, but it's you know, of course there have been violent uprisings against the authority of the Catholic Church as well. You know, and Luik was ruled by a bishop, and at some point the citizens were so fed up that they just tore the cathedral down. Yeah. Okay.
So in your mind, Maastricht doesn't have a abnormal number of churches?
But to me, please correct me, anybody. My impression, these are not facts, people. This is just my sense. No, it's not extraordinary. No.
I think it's interesting to compare, just because, as I said, I think when someone asks why there's so many churches, it sort of makes me feel that wherever they come from, there are less churches.
Yeah, that is probably the case. But you know, I am talking from a frame of reference from a 21st century European.
Yes.
in this Euragian, and my sense of my environment is that it is not out of the ordinary. And even if you look at older cities in the Delta, like for instance Leiden, which has a size comparable to Maastricht, and is a medieval town as well, but of course became Protestant pretty early on, and the same applies to Delft near The Hague, also comparable size. Also dates back to the Middle Ages, and with everything that has been destroyed there, just as is the case here, there are still so many churches there in use in all sorts of ways.
Yeah.
Even after the Catholics were kicked out. So the churches that were built by Catholics are now simply Protestant churches, which means that I forever confuse all of them because they will not be named after saints, which in my mind is a good way of identifying a church, but they will be called the old church or the new church, or and I'm
oh no,
what?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no, to me, like I said, any commentary from people who know more about this than I do is absolutely welcome. But to my sense of what a city this size, this age would be like, no, it's not extraordinary. And maybe the one exception to this is the great monasteries of the countryside having their refugia, their refuge houses here.
Mm-hmm.
So if there were armies roaming the land, they would have a safe house within the walls of the city. But, that existed in other walled towns as well.
Yeah.
So no, I don't think it's extraordinary.
No, it's really interesting. Was there anything that you wanted to add about the question of churches in Maastricht?
Well, I think this is all I can say about it. But like I said,
yeah.
I welcome comments.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for listening to our Ask a Local segment. If you have any information to add to the conversation, we would love to hear what you think. If you have any questions for Lucy or for any one of us, please feel free to ask them through social media or on our website, and we will have a new question to answer next week. Thank you so much for joining us today, and don't forget to follow us on social media. You can find us on Facebook by searching Meet Maastricht, and on Instagram at @meet_Maastricht. If you would like to learn more about us, you can also visit our website at meetmaastricht.eu, where you can buy tickets and subscribe to our monthly newsletter so you're always up to date. Thanks again, and tune in next time to learn more about our beautiful city.
Tot ziens.